They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking.
Hi, this is Nikolai, and you're listening to my dad Rafal, co-host James Jardine, and featuring Mr. Jim Tiller on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Plug in, listen up, and enjoy.
Deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were happy.
Great. That's that. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. I've got both the co-hosts and also that guy. Well, if you don't know who that is, I'll tell you in a second. But Jim, welcome.
It's good to be back. It feels like it's been forever.
We were just talking about that off camera. Like,
that we've recorded. I mean,
forever since we just did this.
Yeah, so it's I'm excited to get back in. And Casey just let you know, like that hype gets you going for about the first 2 minutes.
I'll take it. That's 2 minutes more than I get out of you normally, James. So that's better than nothing. All right. It's we should introduce our guest, the man that took me to my first in-person rugby game. At some point, that will be a trivia fact. Mr. Casey Ellis, how are you, dude?
Greetings. Great to be here.
Are you stateside or are you somewhere down under?
Yeah, no, I'm stateside. Don't let the accent fool you. I feel like I need to change my Zoom backdrop or whatever to re-answer that question because it comes up on just about every call I ever join. But based out of San Francisco.
You need like a eucalyptus tree and a koala behind you. That way it'll just be super authentic.
Yeah, or just keep the punters guessing, right? If I'm here in California, maybe put the Sydney Harbour Bridge behind me and the Golden Gate when I'm down there. That could work.
Yeah, that's right. Like some palm trees maybe just to really mess with people. All right, Casey, you want to tell people who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So, hello. What do I do? That's a great question. I'm probably best known as the founder of BugCrowd. We did not invent vulnerability disclosure or bug bounty programs, but we kind of pioneered this idea of putting a platform in between all of the good faith security researchers and all of the things that need to be done to outsmart the bad guys. So, kicked that off in 2011. Really started working on it, but it caught a tailwind at the end of 2012 and we moved out here. We've been here ever since. Aside from that, I'm also the co-founder of the Disclose.io project. That's really focused on standardizing tooling and basically promoting the adoption of vulnerability disclosure policies to really change the environment for researchers that are trying to operate in good faith. Like a lot of the laws that exist were written before people realized that hackers can be helpful. So we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that the law and just the overall operating environment reflects that. So I do this, that, and the other thing.
Listen, I had this I had this crazy notion of just starting off with, so let's talk responsible disclosure. But then I thought there would be a lot of people mad at me if we went that route right off the bat.
There's never. I mean, if you want to have a 4-hour podcast, you start it off like that. I think
it's the longest short conversation in the history of mankind. I think it's easier to ask people what their favorite cereal is and gain consensus that way.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right. So listen, maybe I'll ask this guy, what in the heck possessed you to leave a job and go, you know what? I want to help people find bugs in other people's code.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I thought I could. So I think there was like a bit of a
that's fair,
just entrepreneurial, itch that I was wanting to scratch. And I think that was kind of a precursor for a lot of this stuff. But yeah, there was a couple of things that I could sort of see happening at the time. Like I've been, grew up hacking all the things, kind of got into security as a career pretty much straight out of high school. So like late 90s, early noughties, just when that industry was in its very early stages of forming. And yeah, coming into BugCrowd, like really I think two things. One was that, what I just mentioned with Disclosure, this idea of like the operating environment for people that, I identified with and still do. Like I enjoy thinking like a criminal, but I don't want to be one. And there's this there's this sort of disconnect between, folks that think that way and their ability to actually, find ways to be helpful. And not help out in fear of their door getting kicked in, right? So I definitely wanted to make a dent on that problem. The other side of it was just that looking at like traditional pen testing, which is a lot of what I was doing back in the day. You can be the best pen tester on the planet. You can have like the smartest person or people in your team, but at the end of the day, when you think about the problem that we're trying to solve, it's basically outsmarting all of the creative adversaries that are out there. They got lots of different skill sets, lots of different motivations for doing their thing, and they're diverse, right? Like one person being paid by the hour is going to lose because of the math. It's not because they're good or bad or any of that other stuff. It's just that construct and how we're kind of solving the problem at the time was to me fundamentally just wrong. So it's like, well, wait a sec, we've got this huge community of of hackers that are at the table wanting to help but don't really have an invite, and then we've got this skills imbalance and this kind of resourcing imbalance in how we're trying to do offense for the purpose of defense. Like, let's just plug those things in together and see what happens. And yeah, here we are.
So, how did why this and why not focus more on fixing or adding to what was and I will contend still is a broken industry in pen testing?
I kind of wanted to do both. It's funny because probably the other thing in the origin story that's interesting is that it was right around the same time that that Facebook and Google and some of those kind of OG technology bug bounty programs were starting to really talk about it. So the experience that I had in Australia working with folk on the pen test side was kind of being able to shop this idea with them, say, hey, like, would 20 people be more effective than one? Like, how do you feel about that? And them kind of turning around and saying, hey, what about this stuff that Google and Facebook are doing? Like, what are your thoughts on that? So there was some really interesting kind of environmental stuff where I think the market just in general was already starting to really question like the actual value and efficacy of pen test at that point in time. When you got consulting companies that can pay like $100 a day, mark it up to $1,500 and have it hit the street at $2,300 a day or whatever it might be. If you've got that kind of margin structure and everyone's walking away happy, like someone's getting screwed, and it's probably the user. So I feel like kind of the adoption of crowdsourcing and this whole idea of security research and this sort of swarm that's available to help out with this stuff, it actually has put a lot of pressure on the pen test industry to do better, basically. Like, it's definitely put some competitive pressure from a margin standpoint, but also just quality wise, it's like, hey, why are we actually doing this? Let's actually try to do it well.
Is that where we see too kind of the shift and see a little bit of pen testing, where you're starting to see more of like continuous pen testing versus the 1 week, 2 week gig? Like we see a lot of continuous pen testing advertising. I think some of the like the bug bounty platforms offer that type of thing, right? Where it's not really the bug bounty, it's more of we're selling that as a pen test. It's just an ongoing one. So I think to your point, Raf, like it did, even though it wasn't the main focus of what was happening, I think kind of a side effect was kind of a maturation of pen testing a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, bug bounty and vuln disclosure, people hear those terms and they're thinking about it in context of like this public program where the entire internet's participating. The reality is that that's only really about 25 to 30% of what BugCrowd does on the platform, and that's been true this whole time. The other side of it is if you've got essentially like match.com for people to break computers, and then you can structure different teams to apply themselves to different things in different ways, you can solve a lot of different offensive security kind of tasks with that. And a lot of people do consume a lot of what we do as a pen test, even if it looks more like a bug bounty to others, right? We've got offerings that are like deliberately targeted at the compliance market, but then we've got the ability to dial up what we're doing from like a risk discovery standpoint to make sure that the quality's still there. There's all different ways to kind of cut the cookie.
Is that a fair number that you threw out there as far as representing public versus private? Because I think a lot of people think bug bounty, they think, oh, I'm opening my system to anybody, when really, when people are especially using platforms like this, right, they're and any of the ones that exist out there,
yeah,
most of the time those are private, right? Is that a fair assessment? Like, is it above 50% that are actually private?
Yeah,
bug bounties?
I think that's right in terms of the customers. I'm like literally like double clicking on a spreadsheet in my head right now, which is not working very well. But yes, like the majority of it is private, in terms of the number of programs that are running. This gets into a weird, it can get kind of into a weird, words are hard problem in some ways, because I think, bug bounty in the sense of like a public vulnerability disclosure program with a reward attached to it, which is what most people think of when they hear the term bug bounty program. That's actually a relatively small number of organizations that are doing that. Using that concept of crowdsourcing and applying it privately, like lots of people are doing that because it addresses a bigger kind of resourcing problem that I mentioned before. And, in the middle of all of that, I do very firmly believe that, every organization should have a vulnerability disclosure program. That's just like, regardless of what you're doing with rewards or any of that type of thing, if you're on the internet, you just need to assume that something's screwed up and someone outside your organization will find that and just be ready for that to happen.
I think a lot of people don't see that distinction between vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty.
Yeah.
Like I think they kind of use that term interchangeable.
Yep. That's right. And I think, sometimes it matters. Like I get pedantic about it, as kind of one of the founders of the industry. I just like it when people aren't confused about stuff like that. And I think sometimes it does matter, especially when, it's like, do we want to encourage people to do security research on us? Or are we just, allowing for that to happen? That's a pretty big operational shift in a company's mindset if they screw those things up. So that's an example of where it matters. I think other times, maybe not so much.
I want to ask, because sorry, Jim, because this is just sticking in my head, and I feel like I need to ask you, because you just said about the difference in the shift in mindset. Back before BugCrowd existed, we had countless conversations in our industry about like why and how would you allow somebody else to go poke at your stuff, particularly in production, particularly in the real world, not in a controlled, staging type of environment where it was all nice and safe. And the conversation at that time was nobody's ever going to allow this to happen. And yet you have a thriving business with customers. What changed?
That's a great question. I'd say three things. One is the market understanding of the fact that like there is a locksmith version of a hacker, not just the burglar version. I think there was a lot of fear around the persona of someone who can hack a thing that existed and was sort of dominant back in 2012, 2013. That that hasn't gone away, but I think people are kind of across this idea that folks that think bad but do good are out there and they are part of the solution. So there's that. I think technology just in general has gotten more internet facing, full stop, right? Like I think that's been, like COVID put that whole thing on steroids when it hit and we all transitioned to work from home and whatever else. But even prior to that, I think there was, like cloud, all these kind of technology trends that just, basically create a public attack surface that folk are going to poke at whether you ask them to or not. That was definitely a factor because, in reality, it's like everyone's running a bug bounty or a vulnerability disclosure program at this point in time. You just might not be getting the report, right? So I think that's become.
I like it. I like that. Say that again.
Yeah, I'll write it down somewhere. But yeah, the third bit would be that I think like the equities of how we make decisions like that as defenders has changed a lot over the last 12 years. yeah, it's a funny coincidence, but the first when we first came out to the US to raise our seed round in 2013, we actually landed the same month that Snowden dropped his disclosures on the NSA side of things, right? And I think that event was one of the first times everyone all at once heard about hacking and cybersecurity as something that might affect them personally. I think prior to that, there was like little pockets of people that were, thinking about it, folk like us standing on street corners and yelling at folk that care about things and so on. But there wasn't this kind of whole of internet, like, oh crap, okay, this might actually matter to me moment. And when you think about that, and you think about what happened after that, like 2014 was 60% of the US getting its credit card breached. 2015 was like Ashley Madison, OPM, like uninsurable stuff getting stolen. 2016, you've got like election interference and all those different things going on. It's just gotten progressively more and more real for folks since then. So I think this whole idea of like, we can just apply like ostrich risk management and pretend there's not a problem and it'll just go away. Like that's been basically debunked at this point. So
So first of all, I just want to start off by saying, man, you and I in a room together with a beer, we would be in trouble. We would be talking for days, right? This is a fantastic topic. I got so much I want to talk to you, Casey, about. But so I'm going to so much. But the one thing that's got taken over my mind is everybody has a pen test for compliance, right? You know what I mean? Everybody asks for it. And I think what you've done is there were sort of these orbs floating around in this whole world of vulnerability, pen testing, all this kind of stuff. And we've tried carving it and cutting it through different ways to give it a different definition. And it's sort of like you honed in on one of the key aspects. And you just finished eloquently laying out kind of all the dynamics that were pointing in that direction to make this a reality, which was a combination of amazing timing on your part and then having an amazing solution. This is super rare. But I think I think you changed at a very tectonic level a lot of the movements in this space, right? So huge hands down to you.
I appreciate that.
When are we going to see it required in compliance? Because I'm telling you that the checkbox approach to pen testing has created an economic thrust in many ways, and we see things like James was talking about earlier with ongoing or continuous pen testing. Whereas I think what you've created, I can see tangible outcomes with regards to that, right? So there's no anyway, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think you will ever see bug bounty as a compliance requirement?
So we've already seen it with respect to vulnerability disclosure. So like Binding Operational Directive 2001 out of CISA DHS, which I was a part of helping write back in 2019, that basically mandates having a vulnerability disclosure program for all federal civilian agencies in the US, and they're optionally able to expand that to a bug bounty program. There's like NIST 853R5 called it out as a thing that's necessary as a security control. Same deal, like VDP by default, but optionally you can turn the heat up and incentivize that and create a bug bounty program. There's stuff happening, like this is my focus as an executive and a leader kind of had this weird shift at some point over onto the policy side, because part of what was happening with all of those things that I just mentioned, like security becoming an issue of retail politics, it became something that folk on the Hill wanted to talk about a lot. And if you can steer that decision making in a way that you end up doing a pincer move on the overall market, like that seemed like a good thing to get into. So I've accidentally become a civics nerd somewhere along the way. I'm not quite sure how that.
There's worse things to be, Casey.
It's worked out well, but it's just been one of those. I wouldn't have expected to be doing that type of thing if you'd asked me 12 years ago, right?
But I think, but to your point, vulnerability disclosure, and I think in James was going in this direction, Raf was going in this direction, is a different animal than I think when we say things like bug bounty. It's a different animal altogether, right?
And I think that's where you see it, Jim, like as Casey was laying out, right? Like the requirements that are out there, at least from a government perspective, of vulnerability disclosure is a very different thing than do we ever see bug bounties being a requirement by anybody? Probably not. That's my guess, but
I would be interested, because I mean, if you throw the ball out 10 years, right? Like if you think about like every vulnerability is like a startup in some ways, like it has value that's able to be commercialized by an adversary. Therefore, there is a competitive marketplace value on that information. And to me, that's just sort of the physics of it, if that makes sense. Do we get to a point where that's represented in its purest form in the market and is actually regulated? Maybe. We've definitely seen like large companies basically mandate bug bounty programs as a part of their vendor risk management strategy. For example, it's like, hey, if you don't feel comfortable enough to invite people in to give you security feedback and then actually reward that, then that to us suggests that your security maturity isn't where it should be. So there's variations of that kicking around the place. In terms of bug bounty itself being mandatory, it'll be interesting to see that play out. I do definitely think we'll see more convergence in like crowdsourcing being an approach to pen testing. So maybe not calling it a bug bounty because of all of the stuff we just talked about before with the term confusion there. But saying, like you can crowdsource this, and that is effectively what we're trying to achieve when we do a pen test. So like it's the same thing, seeing that pop up in PCI DSS or some of those other requirements. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened more as we go forward.
And we know from even the really super early days of pen testing, even back then you would go to 5, 6, some big companies went to more than a couple dozen different vendors to get tests on the same application. Yeah. So they weren't thinking, crowd approach, but that's what they were doing. So I think, it's moving the ball down the field when it comes to developing a more, I don't want to say collaborative type of scenario, but that's kind of what you're doing is you're bringing in a highly diverse set of skill capability and laser focusing on something. There's only good going to come out of that. Yeah, it's going to be painful. It could be costly. It could be tear down your ego if you wrote the application kind of thing. But at the end of the day, I'd rather it happen beforehand than the obvious post event.
Yeah, no, 100%. I do think that the more folk think about assurance as a risk management activity as opposed to a compliance activity, the better off we'll kind of end up from that, and the more likely the data adopt approaches like this, because the challenge, like compliance drives spend in cybersecurity, but we all know that compliance and proper risk management aren't necessarily the same thing. It's a floor, not a ceiling, and a lot of people approach it assuming it's the ceiling. So the more that folk are actually thinking about like true risk, and the more accountable they're made to that, I think the more pressure it puts on them to be thinking about solutions like this one to actually properly assess that. So
So the other side of that coin is, do we raise the bar in compliance? Because let's make the floor the ceiling, but that's a whole other conversation. We'll save for another day.
Yeah.
Right?
So this is I could see what you meant by the beer in a room for a couple of hours thing. Like
exactly.
Yeah.
Listen, I've always thought, like when you guys were kicking this thing off, that the two convergent places where you'd have to solve probably a perception and a policy challenge was at the companies would be afraid to take their apps, take their publicly facing infrastructure to an organization like yours and say, all right, we're going to allow people to break this.
Yeah.
Right. Because I don't, if I'm there, I don't know the people. Like when you're hiring a pen test, you can see the consultant sitting in front of you. Like what effectively I'm doing is saying, all right, folks out there, do your thing. Let's see what happens. Like YOLO. And so there's a perception bit where you have to get over that fear of, boy, what's going to happen? And the simple answer really, I mean, again, sitting around a room and with your peers is, guys, that happens every day, all the time.
Yeah.
You just don't get the results of it if you're not paying somebody.
Yep.
But so there, that's the corporate side. And then you've got like the other side of it, which was folks that were really talented, had a lot of great skill, but they had to be wondering, like, what's the catch? Like, how can I get in trouble for this? Because they've had their lesson, they've learned, right? They would, dude, I could I've lost track of how many really good effort at disclosures were made only to get sued by or attempted to have somebody arrested for literally doing the right thing, only because the curmudgeons on the other side had no idea what they were looking at.
Yeah, and that is still 110% a thing today. I think it's gotten better, and the position that we're in now is that when that happens, it's a lot easier to explain to the curmudgeon on the receiving side that no, this is actually a good thing. You're not being attacked for real. Yes, your fly's undone, but that's a thing that happens sometimes. So don't, let's get your ego out of the way so we can just get to dealing with the risk side of things. Like, to me, that follow-up conversation is a lot easier to have these days than it was, 10 or 20 years ago. But it's still absolutely a thing. I think when you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's receiving a vulnerability report for the first time, like, it's an inherently threatening thing to go through. And I think Jim, you mentioned it before about as the developer, like, no one likes having their baby called ugly. If you're experiencing that for the first time, there's an inherent confrontation just in the content of that conversation. It's got nothing to do necessarily with the people that are involved. It's just literally the subject matter that can get kind of sticky there. So that's still a thing. And I think the kind of the growth of our category and just kind of the normalization of hackers doing this and it being a good thing, the more of that, there's sort of a virtuous cycle that happens as a result of it, because the more it happens, the more people see it, the more normal it becomes, the more it happens, right? That's sort of been the way it's worked, the whole way through.
Have you managed? Do you think you feel like you've managed to normalize it to the point where there's enough momentum behind it so that it's not like this big scary thing that's happening?
I wouldn't give you, like, I'm pausing because it's improved night and day compared to where it was. I wouldn't say yes to that because I don't feel like the work's done by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure. I don't think it's ever going to get done, really.
Yeah. Like, I'd like to see the CFAA get rewritten to have an explicit carve out for folks that are operating.
I'd like to see the CFAA get rewritten. Period. Like, everything beyond that is gravy.
All right, so that's the interesting is. P.S. The other part of addressing this is kind of why we started Disclosure. This whole idea of, like, let's aggregate threats towards researchers into one space so that people know what that looks like and hopefully not want to get onto that list. Like, let's create boilerplate vulnerability disclosure policy that people can just pick up and use that actually creates legal safe harbor for security researchers if vendors use it, like all those different things, because it's literally trying to create, like I said before, a pincer move on the market where there's enough adoption at the base level, and then there's enough conversation happening top down that they eventually meet in the middle, right? And we saw that happen with the DOJ charging rule changes that got published in 2022. Like, that was the product of 8 years of work trying to get that stuff across the line. That hasn't materialized into an actual change of the CFAA yet, but now the guidance is, as a prosecutor, you have to demonstrate malicious intent before you can bring a CFAA criminal case, as opposed to, like, proving innocence, which is kind of how it's set up right now. At the same time, like, CFAA, we need to be able to prosecute actual cyber criminals. So it's not so much about throwing that in the trash. It's about making sure that there's a carve out that recognizes that there's locksmiths and not just work to be done, right? Yeah.
That's always been the part of this that's been challenging in my mind is this intent, like, what intent. We all want to get paid, right? When we do this stuff, some of us want to get paid, some of us want to get paid, and I think that's the gray dashed, often buried beneath the sand, blown over, forgotten about line that exists there. So walking that for a lot of folks, I imagine, like, if this is your job, you're not out there trying to break into a company and then sell the thing outright, because you lose your livelihood if you get busted.
Yep.
On the other hand, the money to be made, at least what we hear in backroom conversations on the bad guy side, is pretty substantial. But there's always that pull.
Yep.
So normalizing, I think, what more than anything else, I think to attract and build the kind of business that's a sustainable business in this, you had to make the incentive for the good guys to do good guy things.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
least
100%.
somewhere in the ballpark of the good guys being pulled towards doing bad guy things.
Yeah, that's right. And to like absolutely minimize and kill off as much of the friction as we can in creating that kind of white hat career pathway for particularly young folk. Like one of the most rewarding things out of all of this is seeing folks that would have probably ended up, in a life of crime, had they not found an opportunity through stuff like what we do to actually like contextualize their skills and their interests and all those different things, like that think bad, do good kind of mindset into an actual career. Like there's a lot of that. There's one example of a guy who reached out to me. The first time I met him was at a automotive hacking event that we put on in Detroit in like 2018, I want to say, and he was probably 17 years old at the time. And he reached out about a year ago and said, "Hey, thank you so much for inviting me to that. Like, I come from a family where automotive crime is kind of our thing. And had I not gotten exposed to this, that's probably the career path I would have gone off into." And now he's like an automotive security expert, working, doing all sorts of cool stuff. And it's like, that doesn't happen every day in terms of getting pings like that. But the fact that, we've basically made that easier, I think is a pretty cool side effect of the whole thing. Yeah. It's pretty neat.
And we all know people that live on those fringes that if they didn't get the right support, right, folks like you guys didn't provide that avenue, the easy answer is go the other way.
Yep.
Right. Because you've got skills, you've got talent. You don't want to go sit and work a corporate job. No offense to any of us present, right? You don't want to go sit and do a corporate job. You just want to go break stuff and find new and exciting things. And this gives you this is like the ultimate ADHD for geniuses job.
We are like a gravity well for neurodivergence. Like it's insane. Like
you don't say.
and I mean that as the highest compliment to everyone who's involved. But yeah, just the different kind of folks that aren't necessarily, a clean fit into a corporate environment. Like even that, like the friction that can pop up on that side of things. This is an alternative way to contribute there and not have to kind of navigate that side of it. So yeah, it's fun.
Can I ask, because you guys primarily work with contractors, right? It's not staff, it's contractors. You guys have a staff that maintains a company, but you basically people 1099 into this gig. Yeah?
Effectively, yeah. I'm trying to give the not get me in trouble with the IRS answer if I don't get the details exactly right. But yeah, essentially, so the folk in the crowd, they work. There's a couple of different ways that they engage. Pay for success, which is kind of what we're talking about on the bug bounty side. Like the first person to find, a unique issue is the one who gets rewarded for it, and the more impactful that issue, the greater the reward, right? But we also engage based on pay for time and then pay for task. So if we're going through and having a pen test, for example, that has to a methodology needs to be followed for the sake of a compliance artifact or whatever else, then we'll have someone go through and actually get engaged, pay for task or pay for time alongside folks that are being incentivized based on success. So there's a bunch of different ways we cut it up, but yeah, to your point, they're external to the company.
So how do you manage that? Because they're not your employees. You're essentially herding cats, right? And you're making sure, like, your job is to make sure they stay interested and stay engaged and stay good while thinking bad. That's an interesting, like, how does that work?
Lots of swag and parties at conferences, and I mean that is definitely a part of it. Community is a huge and very deliberate component to what we do, and it's kind of always been that way. Honestly, that was partly foresight and partly just observing what already worked for the hacker community and trying to find ways to kind of accelerate that and give people opportunities to gravitate together. If you do that, then what you end up with is the ability to influence the entire group, because your core are the ones that are doing the repetition of the message out to their peers, as opposed to us going out and trying to talk to 500,000 people all at once and telling them what to do, right? So community plays a huge role in that. I think just practically, like, we don't, from a technology standpoint, we've got, it is literally like match.com for neckbeard hackers that break stuff is going to, well, not, you get what I mean.
Yeah, totally.
It's,
understand that.
Understanding who's got what skill set, who lives where. So when we're doing defense work, for example, they're pretty concerned about citizenship and dual citizenship with sanctioned countries and all those different things. So we need to be able to answer those questions and still get them the right skills. So that's one example of that. And then just, how what's the evidence that we have to suggest that they're trustworthy and professional? Like, to what degree do we feel confident in that? And if we need to match that with a customer for whom that's a really high concern, then we make sure that we're indexing off that, right?
How do you get started? So I'm sure there's at least a couple of somebodies that are listening right now going, that sounds fun. What do you do to get started with working on the good guy side of bug bounty programs and organizations like yours?
Yeah, I mean, literally just signing up at bugcrowd.com. There's a bunch of different options for like joining communities. We've got Discord, we've got Slack, we've got all those different things where you can get in and just start to meet people and share stories, swap skills, like help each other out. I think like a lot of the content that we put out is around, we've got a thing called BugCrowd University, which is essentially, the goal of it is to have content that can take anyone, regardless of where they are, to kind of the next level of skill that they might be wanting to pursue. And every time there's a new technology that drops itself on the internet and causes a trash fire, we add a new kind of module to that. So there's a lot of machine learning and AI stuff in there at the moment. We did a bunch around IoT when that first kind of caught fire, and so on. I think those things are all useful. Just signing up with BugCrowd and starting to engage with community would be the simple first step. What's
the hottest corner of your market, and why is it AI right now?
AI is, AI is definitely the hottest in terms of attention. We've been working in machine learning and AI adversarial testing since probably 2018 or so. We started getting pulled into the social media companies around some of the stuff that they were trying to figure out at the time. But then when the foundational LLM models started to drop, Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, they're all customers and have been for quite a while now. So we're pretty tied into all of that. AI itself is a really interesting, it's sort of like how I imagine having a website would have been in like 1997. You know what I mean? There's this massive peak in the hype cycle, and we're kind of now, I think, just coming out of the trough of despair off the back of that. We're starting to figure out what we actually use this stuff for. And yeah, I think it's, for anyone doing security research, understanding how to use AI as a tool to make you more effective in whatever you're doing, I think that's a really important skill to have, because that's going to get competitive quickly. It's definitely, actually targeting AI and trying to get models to misbehave. That's a really interesting area of research that people can get into. I think the thing that I'm most concerned about, where I can sort of see a future trash fire, is kind of the unintended consequences caused by basically bolting this stuff into whatever, without really thinking through the security side of it. Like, anytime new technology drops and there's a competitive pressure on getting that technology out to market, there's always a trash fire that follows.
Yeah.
And we're overdue for that a little bit on the AI side of things. I think vibe coding will probably have something to do with it. But yeah, it's hot. I mean, there's others. I tell people to learn like Java, ASP.NET, and COBOL. because like that shit's going to kick around for forever. And the kind of folks that have the ability to interact with those systems from a security standpoint, they're aging out of the market at this point. So it's like this counterintuitive career path for young players looking to upskill and find their niche. Hardware's hot too. I think the Typhoons and all of the state-on-state stuff that's going on at the moment. I think, hardware kind of got the oxygen sucked out of the room a little bit by all of the AI kind of hype. Now we're realizing that it's horribly vulnerable and actively targeted. So I think that's going to continue to ramp up as well from a demand standpoint. Yeah.
All right. Anybody else want to throw anything out before you let them go?
AI question without just saying AI, because it's a thing, but it's by far, it's not the only thing by a long stretch.
I'm glad to hear that, because that is, I'm dreading. I mean, we're a couple weeks out from RSA, and I am dreading getting out there and seeing the endless sea of AI things that we're going to get sold.
You said it perfect. You're just bolting it into everything, and there's going to be consequences to that, sadly. Hopefully we'll just get ahead of it, but I don't know, it's moving pretty fast, but I think you really nailed it down with that statement, honestly.
Nice outlook, Jim, thinking we're going to get ahead of anything in security. I like that.
Yeah.
Good luck, buddy.
There's an optimist if I ever met one.
There's a lot of good work done on like safety guardrails and kind of policy around that. I think there's been a lot of focus early on around the consequences, when it comes to like data and where data goes, because there's a lot of really bad decision making happening around that at the moment as enterprise start to implement LLMs. But there's been some things that I feel like we've sort of tried as an industry to get ahead of. My biggest concern, honestly, is just all of the second order consequences and how those things shake out over time, because I don't think we're even really thinking about that stuff yet.
Mm-mm.
Well said. It's a good place to end, man.
Hey, one more question. I want to. Do you see, like AppSec? We've seen a huge shift in people were pen testers. That's what security was, and now it's like everybody comes from a development background because you have to understand the platform. You have to understand this stuff. Do you see that same shift on the vulnerability disclosure side of skill sets for people, or are they still really just, hey, I can look at a system from external and be able to break it, but that's it. Like I couldn't tell you how it really works or how to fix it, but I can break the heck out of some stuff. Do we see that same kind of requirement on the bug bounty side, where people now coming more from a, hey, I know development or I know these infrastructure pieces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I like yes, like it's definitely diverse. I think the thing is that like every hunter, like we go back to the little kind of neurodivergence hat tip that we had earlier, right? Like you've got your like ADD, like hummingbird on crack hunters who have their kit bag of vulnerabilities that they really, really like, and they get really good at finding them in weird places, right? So like that's sort of QA. Like that's not necessarily someone who understands how a system's constructed. They just know how to exploit stuff.
Yeah.
That's one version, but then you get your folks that come in that understand the system. They can generally create higher order impacts, and they're actually a lot of fun to work with when they start to collaborate. So you'll get like a hardware target, like a car, for example. You've got the QNX like embedded person. You've got someone who understands radio. You've got someone who understands like callbacks to cloud and API security, because ultimately that vehicle is part of an ecosystem that one person's not going to understand in its entirety, right? It's a mix. I do think that's network, like just straight up network exploitation is becoming a little bit of a lost art. And when you look at what the bad guys are doing, they're still pretty focused on that type of thing. So there's definitely a bit of a shift away from that. But
do we see a maturation at some point where it's almost like the criminal enterprise, where I've got somebody that can find cross-site scripting in anything, and then they go and hand that to the next person that can say, okay, I can take it and I can look at it in the context of this app and say, I can take that cross-site scripting into remote code execution, to get to, like, do we get to that point
That's already a thing today. So,
Okay.
like, yeah, 100%. Like so BugCrowd supports that on platform in terms of ad hoc collaboration. But if you get into like groups where hunters are collaborating on the same program, you'll see it often. It's like, hey, does anyone have an SSRF in this? Because they've found something else and they need to complete that chain, and maybe those types of vulnerabilities aren't the ones that they're most used to trying to find, right? So you can see a lot of that sort of stuff going on. Yeah. Which is how the bad guys do it, right?
Right.
Like you think
exactly
brokers and your ransomware operators and then your actual ransom like mule groups and all that kind of stuff. They all have their own.
Right. That's a great way. Like, I got somebody kind of the entry level or whatever that can find the SQL injection, but maybe I can't figure out how to actually exploit that to the level we need. Let me hand that off to tier 2 support here. And they come in and they're like, hey, look at this. I could domain admin.
Your Voltron robot assembles and then they go off and do cool stuff. Yeah.
Voltron robot. All right. If we don't quit now, we're gonna that's peak right there. We're done. But we've gone Voltron. I'm calling time. That's amazing. Casey, thanks for so much of your time, man. It's been a rousing 46 minutes or so here. Hopefully you guys have paid attention and gotten something out of this the whole way through. I'll hopefully get you back on. We'll definitely see at RSA. Maybe we'll stop running each other and record something where we make fun of the stuff on the showroom floor. Every year I go and I say I'm not gonna spend an episode just making fun of things, and then I do because it's so bad.
There's gonna be a lot of
shenanigans.
Tag cloud bingo going on this year.
Yes, 100%. All right, Casey, thanks so much. James, thanks for being on. Folks, thanks for listening. This has been another Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Play the intro. Time to go. See you later.
This is Bella. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave my dad a review and share this with your friends. Bye.